We're going to be talking about useCallback. Now, useCallback is a React hook that lets you cache a function definition between re-renders. This is the official React documentation, but what that basically means is that useCallback will save that function definition, and it's not like use.memo where it saves the value or the return value of a function. useCallback saves the function itself, because usually on every re-render, a function is being recreated as a new value. And I'll go through that in a second. But let's take a look at the setup that we have right here. On the right-hand side, you can see some text, which is the useCallback definition. You can see a hi, a 0, an increment button, and a toggle button. This toggle button just toggles a Boolean value. On the left-hand side, starting from line 4, you can see a child component, which takes in a prop and it console logs child rendered. And it shows the text and the number props, just as you can see on the right-hand side here, a hi and a 0. And now at the bottom, we have our parent function, our parent component, or the app component, and you can see a console log parent rendered. And in this component, we have two states. We have a value, which I initialize at 0, and then I have a Boolean value, which I initialize with false. And then we have two functions. You can see we have an increment, which every time I click the button at line 33, it'll fire the increment function, and our state for the value, this one at line 16, is going to increment by 1. We also have a toggle function, which will just flip the truth or false value of that Boolean. Now you can see that this app component, or the parent component, it renders the child component, and I've passed in hi and num with 0. And you can see these are both non-functional values, right? It's just a string and it's just a number. So what happens when I click on increment right now? Every time I increment, you can see the parent has rendered and the child renders. Now, the parent renders because the state changes, right? This value in line 16 changes, so this component is re-rendered. And by default, all child components are also re-rendering, and therefore our child component down here, you can see the console log. If I hit increment again, you can see that now there are 3 sets of parent and child rendered. Similar, if I click toggle, we again are re-rendering because toggle changes the Boolean state. Now, in order for the child to not re-render, what we can first do is actually use something called a memo, React.memo. And what that does is that it says that if the props are the same, then we don't have to re-render the component. So what we can do is, in line 4, what we first have to do is actually wrap this component in a React.memo. So what I can do here is just put a bracket over this around the entire function that returns the component, right? Now our child is memoized. So if the props are the same values, then we don't need to re-render the child component. So let's go ahead and see what happens. Let me just clear the console here on the right-hand side. Filter it. All right. Now, if I increment, right, it says parent rendered twice, parent rendered 3 times. If I toggle the true or false values, it's only the parent that's rendering. So we haven't gotten to the useCallback just yet, but I wanted to show you that useCallback needs to be used in conjunction with React.memo. React.memo says, okay, if the props are the same, then don't re-render the component. Now let's go ahead and pass in a function to our child component, and we can just pass in line 19's increment function. So let's just say inc, and let's pass in increment. Now we're passing in a function, and now you can see child is re-rendered. It's rendered. Why is that happening now, even though we've memoized it? It's because this increment function is being recreated every time our app component is being re-rendered, every time the state changes. So increment is passed into our child in line 32. Every time we're passing in this function, it's a new function. So what React.memo says is if it's the same value, don't do anything, don't re-render. But if it's a different value in the props, then re-render. And increment is in fact a new function every time. So if I change this increment value, child component is being rendered. How do we fix that? Well, that is where useCallback comes in. So let's see what happens if we wrap this increment function in a React.useCallback. Wrapping it here, and React.useCallback actually takes in a dependency array as well, similar to use.memo, which basically says if a certain value changes, then let's call this, let's compute this function as a new value, right? So I'm clearing the filter, and now that we have useCallback, we've wrapped our increment function in it, and then we've passed it in line 32. What happens if I hit increment? Parent rendered, parent rendered, parent rendered. We've fixed this issue where increment is being generated as a new function value every time, thanks to useCallback. Now, what does this dependency value do? Well, let's say we put this Boolean state as the dependency value. Basically, it's saying if this state changes, this increment function is going to be recomputed as a new value, or it's just going to be recreated as a new value. So let's see how that looks like in real life. I'm going to clear my console. I hit increment, only the parent renders, and only the parent renders, and only the parent renders. Now I'm going to hit toggle, which changes line 17's false to true, right? And the dependency value is in fact this Boolean. If I hit that, you can see that the child is rendered, right? But typically what would we use is a value that's being used inside this useCallback. So that's why we have this yellow squiggly line. Let's change it to value. So basically, anytime the value changes, this increment function is going to be recalculated as a new function. So let's clear that, and I hit increment, parent, child. Parent, child are being re-rendered. But now if I hit toggle, only the parent is being rendered. And that's because our dependency value is no longer the Boolean, but the value. So that's to sum up what useCallback is used for.